So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to all the speakers in this panel as well. Some really fascinating talks, and also thank you to my supervisors, Melissa, who's here, and Patton and Robert Betteridge. So the paper I'm giving today forms part of my PhD research into examining and exploring legacies of race and slavery in the early Encyclopaedia Britannica from 1768 to 1860. That's the first 8 editions that were published. From here, I'll probably shorten it to EB because it's a bit of a mouthful. And my presentation seeks to address how we can identify and connect information points in the EB that are spread disparately, that can be quite difficult to establish meaningful connections without the use of digital methods. For an overview, I'll just give you a quick introduction to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the method I use for network analysis, some comparative findings, and a combined conclusion and recommendation section. Now, there is a content warning. This research is examining legacies of slavery and includes examples of historic language use and some derogatory racial terms. I will need to draw on some of these, but it's the context of the piece. Just a warning. So why the Encyclopaedia Britannica? So although EB's a household name now, and I think most people are familiar with it as a publication and now in its current form online, it came from quite humble beginnings in Edinburgh in Scotland, first published in 1768 under the editor William Sniley. It was published serially, so you bought little sections of it until you could combine all of the little pieces and create complete volumes. It was a reference publication drawing together knowledge of science and arts, and that was the real focus. And it aimed at uniting elements of knowledge into a single publication and bringing all these topics together under unified, larger articles. So at the time it was being published, it's coming from this Enlightenment context, Scottish Enlightenment context, but at the height of transatlantic slavery, rising abolitionist sentiment throughout this period, and sort of British abolition movement and legislation that gets passed. So the Slave Trade Act of 1807 and the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. So although my PhD looks at 8 editions, I'm narrowing my focus to look at the first edition and the 7th edition. So the first was published between 1768 and 1771. And the 7th edition was written from 1827 and continued to be written across the period it was published between 1830 and 1842. These were collaborative efforts, so there were overarching editors, but there were lots of individual contributors, which does make this research slightly more difficult. Some of the contributors are known, some of them are not documented, so it does become quite a difficult territory to navigate in terms of expressing opinions. Just to give you a quick insight into size, the first edition comprised of 3 volumes, each of which were about that thick. By the 7th edition, there was 19 of these volumes, so it then became a huge publication, which is also why digital methods are needed here. In recent years, there have been a number of DH projects focusing on encyclopedias, including looking at citation strategies, topic modeling, and automation of article indexing. And this quote at the bottom from encyclopedia scholar Jeff Loveland always sticks in my mind. Although he recognises the potential, he states that computer's ability to recognise and interpret patterns of text remain limited, which some people in this room might potentially take issue with. However, I think part of this research is about bridging that disconnect between scholars in other fields and humanities methods, and making sure that methods and texts are available for everyone. So my data sets, I'm working with first edition, which comes from the National Library of Scotland's Data Foundry. I then created my own version of this using images from their Data Foundry, which I downloaded. They do have an OCR version, however, the quality was terrible, and even with basic cleaning, I've worked on a few projects that have had issues working with it. So I used Transcribus, the automatic text recognition software, to create my own model. This had an accuracy rate of 97.59%, which was reasonably high, not perfect. The amount of data I was working with, that's good enough. And the 7th edition is from the 19th Century Knowledge Project, which is run by Peter Logan. This was available at the time that I started the project, and why reinvent the wheel when there's already a data set available. So those are the two data sets I'm using. So what this presentation is really looking at is visualization as a prompt. So this quote here, I think, summarizes this quite well. This research is very exploratory. It's about trying to establish how you can approach large volumes of text, how you can look at changes or revisions following specific topics all the way through, and the difficulties that presents. And in some cases, I don't have perfect answers. So visualizations can aid historical research and establish relationships in the data, but we need to resist the urge just to treat visualizations as an endpoint. And that's very much a theme, which I don't have enough time to go into fully. However, this forms a very large part of my research. So initially I started with text scoping, trying to see what appears, what didn't appear. So I did some basic text mining using a select number of keywords, just to see what would appear. So here's a selection of my keywords. I do have a larger list, but this is a sort of representative sample. Some of them are very clearly indications of explicit mentions of slaves, slavery, slave trade, a couple of associated racial terms, commodities, and places that were associated with enslavement, and concepts, abolition, recognition, emancipation, related terms. So obviously this yielded reams and reams and reams of information. Some of this is quite general. Africa, for example, not every mention that comes up will be relevant to the topic. However, it starts to build this wider picture from which we can try to establish connections or see where connections are not made. So the 7th edition by itself got over 18,000 hits, which is a ridiculous spreadsheet. And looking at the data, how on earth do you start to make any meaning from that? So this is why I decided to use network analysis and try and visualize some of the data. And thinking about how to use the ED structure to really dive in and use those explicit sort of guided directions that the publication gives and how information was being directed at the time versus the information we can pull out. So looking at structure, for anyone that's not familiar with the early Encyclopaedia Britannica, each page is double column spread. The articles look like the image here on the left. So there is an article heading, which is capitalized, the main body of the text, and in some cases there are cross-references. This doesn't appear for all of them. The cross-references appear as see England, see slave, see article name. On the right, there is an indication of what the index looks like. So the 1st edition does not have an index, the 7th edition does. And this provides a very guided way of navigating information. So you have index topics, and then all of the suggested areas that you should look up. So volume number, page number, and topic gets listed. Note that the topic does not directly relate to the article title. In some cases it does, but I have to do a lot of following up to match up information. And in some cases, it also cross-references to other elements of the index, in this case, see Negroes. So the results that I did with the scoping and trying to establish the data I could use were gained through keyword and cluster searches using AntConc, freely available text analysis tool. And I compiled these into CSV formats to use with visualization software Gephi. So I then generated some graphs. Now, this raised questions of what exactly do you look at, how on earth do you start to tackle this? So based on the structure that I just identified, I came up with these ways of navigating. So explicit links, which keywords have a dedicated article, sugar, Jamaica, slave, for example. Do the articles contain cross-references? If yes, what are these? If no, leave it, that's fine. Number 2, which keywords appear as cross-references? These might not be flagged up in that first iteration of searches, so this just identifies other mentions throughout the text. Number 3, relevant for the 7th edition, does a keyword feature as an index term? If it does, what does it then point you to, and how do you start to connect And then the other category is implicit links, which is perhaps not entirely the right word for this, but this looks at the more hidden connections, the words that appear throughout the text, throughout the main body. So things that you would not be able to establish unless you physically read every single volume of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, which would be probably a lifetime's work, and then maybe another lifetime to go over. So this was trying to establish all the wider mentions that might come up that would be difficult to establish. So first, network analysis, not really what you expect with network analysis. I'm including these purely because they're a good comparative point for later on. So lost my place in my notes, which is not very helpful. So first of all, for each of these, I've got a first edition and a seventh edition side by side just to do some small comparisons. So you have limited connections. You can see the first edition more. There are more connections, there are more cross-references appearing in our relevant articles, but these are largely aligned with sort of common commodities and geographic terms like countries. Overall, not many of the articles contain cross-references. The seventh edition doesn't really contain that many in comparison to the first edition, purely because it's an index. So despite the fact it's an index, they still use some cross-references, but not particularly consistently, as far as we know. Which just adds to the fun of trying to figure out how to work with this. So yeah, a lot of the mentions you get here are geographic or commodities that then relate to the plants that they originate from. This starts to tell you that there are mentions of slavery, there are mentions of places where slavery is taking place, commodities that are being produced by slavery, but it doesn't really tell you how much of a discussion is taking place. Secondly, keywords that appear as cross-references. So again, maybe fewer of these in the first edition, more in the seventh, a few more links to different articles in the seventh as well. But we see sort of recurring patterns, a few new mentions, so Negroes being cross-referenced in the article for Blacks. But you see some similar sort of patterns emerging. Slave is cross-referenced in the Alligati article, which refers to the basis kind of slaves in Roman antiquity. And in early editions, this is a recurring theme of there are lots of mentions of classical slavery and classical civilizations. So you get ancient Rome, ancient Greece quite consistently. And this is used as a sort of model. These references appear consistently throughout. So gladiators, slavery is mentioned there, for example. So yeah, you have, it's interesting that this link is made because there is very few links to slavery that's happening contemporary to publication in the first edition, and it's only in the seventh edition that you really see this shift. So something that might be a little bit more exciting to look at. So mapping the index term at the seventh edition offers a much more substantial insight into how slavery and slavery-related terms were being presented and how readers were being directed to them. During the time that the seventh edition was being published, the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 was passed, and you start to see more of a shift in discussion as this is happening, and there's a lot more mentions taking place. The index terms and the article names are not necessarily equal, so I've indicated keywords in square brackets in article terms. Article headings don't have square brackets, just so you can distinguish some of the words appearing here. So this approach enables some information discovery in the network that would be otherwise really difficult to match up. This obviously only contains a small snapshot of the content that features in the index. It doesn't represent everything. I think there is definitely work that could be done there to link up things that would make the data and the huge quantity of information more accessible to researchers. So that's potentially some further work that could be done. So this is a little bit of a mess, but you can see from the scaling of the terms, sugar appears, has a huge number of articles under its index term. Cotton manufacture is also quite significant. Slavery is also a very large point. so is Negroes, as is Africa, which makes sense. The 7th edition has a much wider geographic spread in its articles. It has a concerted effort to make sure that more geography is being documented. So this kind of makes sense that there's a lot more discussion of certain areas. Cotton and tobacco also feature on the left of the main hub. So you start to get more of these insights. Now, the good thing about Gephi is that as well as exporting the larger files, you can also navigate and hover over nodes so you can identify connections, which to me has been one of the most useful aspects of this research because it means that I can navigate through different connections. I can look at specific keywords, specific articles, and try and match them, try and conceptualize what was produced in, rows and rows and rows of spreadsheets. And I think this is probably something that other researchers in other fields that maybe don't have as much of a DH approach would also benefit from the ability to navigate through some of these. So just a couple of examples of focusing on some of these connections. So the index picture I showed you earlier, I've drawn up this for slave trade. So this shows you all of the articles that are under the slave trade term. Again, you have a focus on geographic articles, notably quite significant colonial powers. You've got Britain and America. The line, the edge from slave trade to Britain is quite thick. There are lots of mentions of the slave trade in the Britain article, probably because this is a British publication and there's a discussion of what's happening in Britain at the time, and that forms a large portion of the content of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. You also get biographical articles, so William Wilberforce and William Roscoe, early abolitionists mentioned. And you also get reference to Brian Edwards, who have familial links with slavery and was quite influential in writing histories of Jamaica. This gives you quite a broad overview of the topics that you might want to look up under slave trade. Now, the index for slave trade had also added the cross-reference of seen Negroes. So if you look this up in the index, the image at the bottom here is the range of articles that you get. So you start to get much more pointed discussion of skin color with complexion. There's also the anatomy article and the man article, both of which have these really strong attempts to categorize, try to make sense and understand the world, the world that people were living in, and to account for differences in skin color and differences in culture. This is very reductive in a lot of ways, but you start to see a lot of these discussions happening there. The slavery article is obviously also referenced, and geographic articles that relate to places where we know that Black slavery was taking place. Just for an additional comparison, on the right, I've also got the index term for slavery, which gives you where you're directed to look at. It takes you to the slavery article, it takes you to Socrates and Aristotle's philosophy, again, coming back to the idea of classicism being expressed, heavy links with slavery that appear throughout. Lots of geographic articles. Interestingly, there are no links made to commodities that are produced by enslaved labor. And there's sort of an erasure of discussion there, so it's a disconnect between slavery and the labor that's slavery, the enslaved labor that's being used to produce commodities that the British society is benefiting from. So moving on. Excuse me. So looking at occurrences of keywords throughout the text with the articles, there are lots more mentions, as you might expect. There's a lot of discussion that's taking place outside the formal referencing structures. Some of these are very passive mentions. There's lots of references to slavery as metaphor. These appear in some of the religious biographical articles. And yeah, some areas you perhaps wouldn't expect, but it shows you how pervasive slavery was through society in language use. And we also start to get more of a picture being built up of a history of slavery that doesn't simply focus on the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks practice slavery. There's seemingly a gap, and then suddenly transatlantic slavery, you start to get more mentions of enslavement happening at different points in time in different geographic locations. So to give you a quick overview of what you're looking at here, I have another slide on this too. But the first edition, this is 593 nodes, which represents 48 keywords, and the remaining ones are article headings. The seventh edition is 3,227 nodes. 3,166 of these are articles, and 61 represent keywords. And in the seventh edition, this graph represents the 18,314 individual mentions of keywords that were relevant. This has been coloured by community detection, purely because it helps to visualise different areas. It's a very dense graph in places, so it's quite difficult to tell what links to what without navigating through in Gephi in the interface. But here I have some labels added. So it gives you a small insight into the types of keywords and all the articles that were being referenced around them. So commodities are again a very common theme. Cotton, sugar, tobacco appearing in both. Rice also appearing in the seventh edition. So a strong focus on commodities, things that benefiting the British economy, British society. And you get a lot of focus on geographic terms as well, and these account for very large portions of the instances of keywords that were being returned. So as the EB grew from the first edition through to the seventh, you see an explosion in the types of discussions, which does happen gradually. I think there's also the important factor to consider that this was a very, very large publication that was being released over a number of years. So some of the topics being discussed are not necessarily representative of what exactly is happening at the time. In some cases, there's an information delay of what's being communicated, which does make part of this analysis quite tricky. For example, the slave article in the first edition was actually borrowed from another encyclopedia that was written 30 years earlier. It was deemed good enough to use for the time being, but it doesn't necessarily give as much information as you might potentially expect to see in 1768. So what we have with these links is that there are actually lots of mentions of places where enslavement is taking place, commodities that were resulting from enslaved labour, however, not really getting much of a connection directly with the concept of slavery, the slave trade, or the identification of slaves having a role in this. So there's a lot that's happening behind the scenes, which isn't really matched up in these visualizations, which is quite difficult to navigate. So that raises the question of how on earth do you start to go about that? And I said that I didn't want to leave visualizations as the end point, and that is certainly not the case. The next chapter of my thesis is looking at how to use all of the results from visualizations. How do you make any sense of discussing that? Again, I probably have a lifetime of work trying to do this. However, it does make for a very long list of future publications, perhaps. So before I close out, I just picked out a couple of examples from close reading to give you a very, very brief insight into some of the mentions that you get here. So in the Africa article, there's a lot of discussions of domestic slavery taking place. However, you also get this reference which states whole shoals of sharks may be seen in the Bight of Benin and that neighborhood, following the slave ships in particular, from which no day occurs without some unfortunate victim being launched overboard. It's a comment that's made very passively. The article then moves on to other discussions. It sort of demonstrates how casual mentions of enslavement could be in the expendability of human life. It does have a slight negative overtone to the discussion, but there isn't anything explicitly said about it. It's sort of an erasure mission of expressing opinion, which, although you might think the Encyclopaedia Britannica would be quite impartial, the early editions are very opinionated in certain places. The slavery article, you get very, very strong discussions of religious sentiment. And I've read a number of articles that essentially gossip about individuals and their place in society. So it isn't a necessarily impartial publication, but it seems to be picking and choosing of how much subjective information you get in which articles. And then the ornithology article was unexpected reference to slaves, which compares the price of a parrot to the price of buying a slave. Again, a more historical context, but this helps to build out that picture. Just looking at the words slave, slaves, slavery, and slave trade, these appear in 500 separate articles, which is what the next section of my research is focusing on. How on earth do you then start to discuss these and try and give some close analysis based off the results? Are there any ways that we can categorize the information without replicating these systems of information and structures that we've seen historically that are very problematic? How do you go about trying to untie these connections and establish where there are omissions that are made?
Ash, we only have like 8 minutes for questions now, so
I'm up. There we go.
sorry.
So, that doesn't look going.
That's the same as the mic.
I just have to.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So, for conclusions, network analysis has helped to reconstruct complex knowledge systems digitally. I think this is a really good way of exploring lots of different, very complex ideas. I think it's not a perfect solution. It's difficult to wrangle the information in the first place in some instances. It also requires a lot of subjective input. But what the network analysis has really helped to do is enable detection of lack of slavery connections. Although part of this was sort of expected, it confirms the omission of connections between commodities and places where enslaved people were working. But it helps to surface hidden information that would not be possible to find disparately without reading through every single article in every edition. So hopefully this produces a replicable approach to exploring singular topics in encyclopedias and reference works, and it's something that could be applied outside of enslavement and in other encyclopedias and reference publications. Apologies.